All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for Out of the Archives, a look back at the Marshall Plan with the Truman Presidential Library. 2 years after VE Day, Europe lay in ruins with its economies devastated and its people facing famine. In a commencement address at Harvard University, Secretary George Marshall called for American assistance in restoring the economic infrastructure of Europe. Western Europe responded favorably, and the Truman administration called for legislation. The resulting massive aid package, the biggest of its kind and named for Marshall, provided more than $13 billion in funding for housing, infrastructure, and industry. The story of Europe's post-World War II recovery is often told with numbers. But now, Mark Adams, the education director at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, will share the human side of the story, drawing on the Truman Library's rich archival collection, from drawings by school children to an urn of blood-stained soil to the original audio recording of General Marshall's Harvard commencement speech. We'll delve into the vault of a stunning collection of artifacts and a fascinating out-of-the-archives experience. Nearly 100 of us. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mark for joining us this afternoon. And Mark, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Great introduction, and great to have everybody online this afternoon. We're high 80s, so we've got almost 100 people. So I'm going to go straight into my presentation. We're going to do questions at the end if we may. It's just a little easier to manage that and do the questions that way. I am the education director at the Truman Library, and I've been at the library 26 years. And I've done a presentation for Robert before through this group, so it's great to be back. And I appreciate the invitation. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll get my screen share up here. And as Robert mentioned, this is out of the archives, looking back at the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was passed in April of 1948. So actually this year we're honoring the 75th anniversary of the passage of the legislation. So as Robert mentioned, the speech was in 47, but it took until the following spring to get the legislation passed through Congress. So we're going to talk about that part of the story. We are going to delve into our archives and museum collection here at the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. We have 16 million documents in our archives and about 33,000 museum objects here in the building that I'm working in today at the Truman Library. And we opened in 1957, and Harry Truman worked here for about 15 years. We're only going to see a handful of those documents and archives today. We're certainly not going to see 16 million, but we're going to see a few, and a few artifacts as well, and some photographs along the way, and some really neat things I think you might not have seen before. So let's go ahead and dig into our topic, and thanks again for the invitation. So here's just some of a scattering of some of the objects and artifacts and materials we're going to look at today. I'm going to talk about each of these at length a little bit later on, but just to kind of give you a taster as a kind of an introduction to our program, you see a school children drawing on the top left. We see a handwritten letter by Harry Truman on the bottom left as I look at the screen. In the center of the panel is the legislation itself, the European Recovery Act, as we're going to talk about. It's nicknamed the Marshall Plan. On the bottom right, you see a photograph from Greece, which is one of the countries that benefited from the Marshall Plan. And then up on the top right is a green urn that came from the Battle of the Bulge, which is on our museum collection. So you can see archives, photographs, legislation, drawings, artifacts, museum artifacts. So we're going to try and talk about the Marshall Plan through the lens of these different types of artifacts today, which is a different approach to this, but I think you'll find enjoyable. So here's the legislation itself, the one that was in the center panel of that previous slide. And this is what's called the European Recovery Act. As I mentioned, it's April of 1948 when it's ultimately passed. We know that Marshall makes this speech at Harvard, which seems appropriate for a location for your library system today, back in the previous summer in 1947. And I've just summarized on the right some of the information that the European Recovery Act was about. In simple terms, it's foreign aid to Europe, but it's done so through the lens of the economy, through the lens of politics, through the lens of trade, and also political stability. And so this quote from the Recovery Act: to promote world peace and the general welfare, national interest, and foreign policy of the United States through economic, financial, and other measures to the maintenance of the conditions abroad in which free institutions may survive, and consistent with the maintenance and the strength and stability of the United States. So I think it's through the United States lens, but it's to help Europe. So we're going to dig into some of the disagreements on doing this, both the money and the politics and so on. But this is what the legislation laid out. You can see Harry Truman's signature at the bottom of the document, along with the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, because it's a piece of legislation. So it's not an executive order, it's a legislation, and there's appropriations associated with that. And we'll talk about that as well, because it's also a little bit unique, the way the money is passed out to Europe. It's a little different than you might expect. So let's move in. That's the big picture. So let's move into the program. First thing to think about is, why is it called the Marshall Plan? This is coming out of the Truman administration. Truman's been in office since April of 1945, after FDR's death in April. And he's got this foreign aid package for Europe all set up, but it bears Marshall's name. So that's the one thing to think about, is what is this relationship between President Truman, and at this time, Marshall is the Secretary of State. He has whole different offices in Truman's cabinet at different times, but at this time period, in 1947, 1948, he's the Secretary of State. Somebody makes mention that's only 2 pages of legislation. There's a lot more beneath that, but yes, the legislation itself is 2 pages. There's 4 different subcommittees that worked on getting that legislation in place, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but thank you for noticing that. So this is where we're going to dig into some of the relationship between Harry Truman and George C. Marshall. He's well known as kind of a hero to Marshall, to Truman himself. He regards Marshall as what he describes as the greatest living American. And then in this letter, and this you can see the last page of this particular letter from July the 10th, 1947. So right at that time period, shortly after that Marshall makes that speech at Harvard in June, he writes to his wife, Bess. And in our archives collection here at the Truman Library, we have more than 1,300 letters that Harry Truman writes just to Bess Wallace Truman, some before they're married, and the majority of them after they get married in 1919. So he says in this letter, and you can see, maybe you can detect the cursive writing there. It's not that easy to read, but the middle paragraph there, I've decided to give the whole thing to General Marshall. The worst Republican on the Hill can vote for it if we name it after the general. So let's interpret that a little bit. He's giving the whole thing to Marshall. So he's giving this idea of foreign aid, what ends up being called the Marshall Plan. He's going to give the name to General Marshall. He's going to give him the credit. Why? Well, one, he admires him a lot, talks about him as being the greatest living American, but he also realizes when it comes to Congress, the Republicans, what he describes as the worst Republicans, will still vote for it if it's named after the General Marshall, because he is held in such great esteem. Now, a quick word on Congress for context. In the 1946 midterms, Truman loses the House and Senate. So he's going to regain them in the 1948 presidential election, which is coming up at the end of the year when we get to the point of the legislation here in April of 1948. But in 1948, when they're voting on it in April, it's a Congress that's dominated by Republicans in both House and the Senate. So Truman knows he needs Republican support. So that's one factor, put Marshall's name on it. And then in this letter to Bess, I love this sentence. had a grand session with Marshall today. He's one fine man. So even to his wife, he's gushing about Marshall. So you can see the regard he holds him, but he also realizes the Republicans hold him in such great esteem as well. So that's going to be helpful to him, he thinks, in getting the legislation passed. Here's a photograph of kind of the key people around the table that were really the architects and, in fact, implementers of the Marshall Plan. You see Harry Truman on the left. This is in the Oval Office in November of 1948. So this is shortly after the election and after the legislation has passed, but as they're starting to enact the Marshall Plan aid. And so you see George Marshall there on Truman's left, and then you see Paul Hoffman and Averell Harriman. Those names are not as well known, but they're the two key people that really carry out the Marshall Plan. They run the Economic Cooperation Administration, and they're discussing the logistics of the plan there in that photograph, and they're the key people around the table. And then on the left, we're going back a little bit to the speech that Marshall made in Harvard in June of 1947. And this is where it's interesting, because the speech is not actually, a wonderful speech in terms of oratory, or he's not banging on the podium. It's quite a quiet speech. Some people thought it was kind of boring, but the message within it, the words within it, are kind of earth-shattering. And so he's describing the situation in Europe post-World War II. Europe is in ruins. The economy is in bad shape. And he feels like it's in the middle paragraph there. It's logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to assist in the return of normal economic health. So that's part of it. But then the next part of that sentence, without much, there can be no political stability and no assured peace. So here we are, 2 years after Germany surrenders in May of 1945, just 2 years later, we're talking about there's no assured peace, there's no political stability. And then Marshall finishes this particular section. Our policy is directed not towards any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Now, Marshall has been to Europe. He's visited Europe. He's really shocked by the conditions there. Truman has visited Europe. He was there in 1945 for the Potsdam Conference and toured Germany. So they're both very well aware of the conditions in Europe. But here we are 2 years later, and they're still describing the economic ruin, the infrastructure, the breakdown of the industry, threats to currency, and even more importantly, and it maybe doesn't get talked about enough, the political instability and the threat of communism in countries like France and Italy. So there is a political component to this as well. And I'm sure that's what the four gentlemen in the photograph are talking about in terms of implementing the program. So this is another photograph of Marshall and Truman. This one's in November of 47, and they're at the airport in Washington, D.C., as Marshall is making frequent trips to Europe to negotiate with what we call the Conference of Foreign Ministers. So those foreign ministers around Europe. Now, what Marshall calls for in his speech is not so much aid pushed on Europe by the United States, but for cooperation for the 16 European countries, as it ends up being, to come together to help form the plan. So it's not a plan that's forced upon the European nations, but the European nations need to buy in, and they need to formulate their part of the plan as well. So that's why it's a little bit different in nature. So he's meeting quite frequently with the foreign ministers in Europe as the legislation is being formed, as that's going forward. So two things are happening. Marshall makes his speech. He then goes to Europe to negotiate with the European countries. In the meantime, Truman is now working on Congress for the legislation, as we've talked about. That doesn't get passed until the following April, which actually in today's terms seems quite quick, but it's almost a year since his speech before he gets the legislation through. So much so that in this fall, in the November and December, they actually passed a separate aid package to some of the European countries because they're in so much ruin. and they send about $500 million over as just a separate piece of foreign aid in the fall of 1947 as kind of a stopgap measure. So the money's already flowing, but the Marshall Plan money is going to look a little different. And then this is another letter from Truman to his wife. We do have a lot of them. I mentioned we have more than 1,300, but he doesn't talk about policy issues that much. So when we have the opportunity, we take the chance to use those in our presentations. And again, you can see part of the letter over on the left. The transcript is on the right. And I've just focused on 3 small paragraphs. Back in March of 47, Truman had started the Truman Doctrine, which was initially to support Greece and Turkey. So that's some context for this letter. But that forms the Truman Doctrine, where Truman is going to protect democracies around the world. So he says in his letter to Bess, "We withdraw from Greece and Turkey and prepare for war. It just must not happen." So he's committed to the aid he's given to Greece and Turkey. In the spring of 1947, incidentally, $400 million was given to Greece and Turkey in aid through the Truman Doctrine. And then it says, to feed France and Italy this winter will cost $580 million. That's the legislation, that's the aid that's just been passed that September. And then he says the Marshall Plan proposals are going to cost $16.5 billion. So a huge difference, $16.5 billion for the Marshall Plan. Now he says, importantly, and I'll explain why, the 16.5 is for a 4-year period and is for peace. If we don't do it, he's predicting a Russian war would cost us $400 billion and untold lives, mostly civilian. So I must do what I can. I shouldn't write you this stuff, but you should know what I've been dealing with, I've been facing with since Potsdam. And Potsdam is the conference in July of 1945, when he met with Stalin and Churchill after the German surrender, right before he dropped the atomic bomb in August. And what he's meaning by that, what he's been facing since Potsdam, is really resistance from Stalin and the growth of communist influence in Eastern Europe in 1946 and 1947. And the speech by Winston Churchill about the Iron Curtain was in the March of 1946. And he's got his Truman Doctrine speech himself in March of 1947. So all of this is going on. Now, he does say the 16.5 is for a 4-year period. So what happens is with this legislation that we saw the first 2 pages of, they do a smaller amount. They don't ask for 16.5 billion right off the bat. They ask for about 6 billion approximately for the first 15 months. And then they come back for subsequent appropriations. And that's one strategy and tactic that helps the legislation get passed, because they're not asking for this huge 16.5 right off the bat. They're going to come back in a year or in 15 months and ask for subsequent appropriations. Well, if the plan is going wrong and the money's not being spent correctly, Congress can refuse those appropriations. So it's a little bit of a gamble on Truman's behalf in a way, because he's not getting all the money in the outset, but he also realizes that this is a way to win over Congress, and they're not spending all of that money. So he's buying a car for 16.5 billion over 4 years instead of putting all of it down as one down payment, if you'll excuse my analogy. But that does help politically get the legislation through, amongst other things. So let's go back and let's talk a little bit more about Congress itself, because this is incredibly important. One thing to remember from your history books, I suppose, is that Truman was a senator for 10 years. He was elected as the senator from Missouri in 1934, and then he becomes vice president after the 1944 presidential election as Roosevelt's running mate, and is inaugurated as vice president in January of 1945, and then ultimately president in April after FDR's death. So he has been in the Senate for 10 years. So that he has good relations across the Senate. He's been in charge of committees. He's been behind legislation. And he has friends on both sides of the aisle. So that's going to be in his favor. However, many congressmen, particularly Republicans, are against this type of huge amount of aid to Europe when the money could be spent elsewhere. Does that sound familiar? Every decade, we have the same not necessarily Europe, maybe Ukraine right now might be a good example, maybe Africa, the third world, other places the United States has helped with aid. Similar arguments, we see those parallels. So we're going to look at Congress. And in this case, I've gone a little bit different. We've gone to political cartoons. And that's because they're my favorite. Full disclosure, in our archives, I love looking at our political cartoons. You really get a sense of the time period and you get a sense of the opposition. This one is from Clifford Berryman, which was in the Washington Evening Star, prolific cartoonist. This is in November of 1947. So as they're getting closer and closer to looking at the legislation. And you can see here, Truman's got his fingers in his ears. He's reading a document that says special session and foreign aid. But Congressman Knudsen is over on the right saying tax reduction, and he's banging his drum. So, you know, different things needed from Congress. Congress is talking about tax reduction, obviously. And Truman wants this special session of foreign aid, which means spending money. So I imagine the tax reduction may be more difficult. So that's one really nice one that you can see some opposition to what Truman's wanting to do. And then here's another one, and this is for the special session of Congress where they're looking at different things. And look at all of these. This is kind of pawns on a chess set. You can see the chessboard on the bottom. They're supposed to be pawns. He's a better cartoonist than me, so I'm not complaining. They're going into this special session. You see the gentleman with the briefcase on the right, Congress. And in this special session, look at all of these things they're considering. Quick aid to Europe, price control at home, long-range Marshall Plan, aid to China, aid to South America. What I found interesting, just as a little aside, this is November of 1947. They're already calling it the Marshall Plan. So the speech was in June. The legislation isn't passed until April of 48, but we're already referring to it as the Marshall Plan. So you can see the wheels are in motion there. And then other expenses too, aid to China, aid to South America, aid to Europe, quick aid to Europe. So a different one, which we just talked about. And then Congress, but I didn't know you were bringing all the relatives, which, you know, he's brought all these other things along. And that means more and more expense, right? If you have to deal with all of these, more feet at the table for maybe Thanksgiving. We're in November when this cartoon is written. So another interesting way at looking at some of the opposition Congress might have. And then Truman makes a special message to Congress in December of 1947, so right before Christmas. He makes an address, a message to Congress, and he's talking about the free nations of Europe, to restore their lives, to restore the sound world economy, support for ideas of liberty and justice. So we're intertwining the economy, you know, standard of living, rebuilding Europe, but also politics, individual liberty and justice. I think between the lines, he's saying that's not happening in the Soviet Union. As we give them moral support, that's going to give them the chance to, you know, pay that back through teamwork, the cooperation from both home and abroad. So this idea of a cooperative plan that the 16 nations have to help form the plan of how the aid is going to be spent, where is it going to be spent, so they're not all fighting over the money. So he really reiterates the fact that this is a joint undertaking between the two bodies of Europe and the United States. There's also some political motivation there too for kind of getting Europe to be more unified itself so that the countries come together. We've just had two wars, World War I, World War II, where Europe was split in two. So the idea here is to try and get Europe to be more unified around the economy, trade, ultimately currency, but not yet. But we know that's coming in the 50s. And ultimately the common market and the European Union down the road. And he says, I want you to proceed as rapidly as possible. So we're ready for this by April the 1st. Well, spoiler alert, the legislation passes on April the 3rd. So Truman gets his way, but it is not an easy task by any means. Here's the legislation when it's passed in April. One thing that people may not realize is that various supporters of Truman go all around the country promoting this, going to social groups, Kiwanis groups, Lions clubs, you name the group, different people were going out to visit different clubs all around the country, making speeches. More than 100 congressmen make trips to Europe to see the situation in Europe and then report back. They form 4 subcommittees, one through the House, and then the other 3 are bipartisan, both House and Senate members, that report on different aspects of the implementation of the plan. And they include Republicans in every one of them. And they come back unanimously in favor of the plan and how it's going to be implemented. What Truman's strongest ally and George Marshall's strongest ally was a Republican, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who really pushes this through to help get it through Congress in April. Here's the signing of the legislation. Mostly happy faces. There's always some glum ones. Maybe that's just the way they look. But this is Truman signing the legislation there on April 3rd, 1948, 75 years ago this year, back in April. And so how does Europe react? Of course, they're very grateful. I've got a couple of examples of artifacts I wanted to share with you. This one predates the Marshall Plan, but it's a good example of the type of materials that we have in our archives of grateful Europe. So this particular urn comes from Belgium. It's made of jade green malachite, as it says there. And it's got coats of arms of various towns in Belgium that were involved in the war in Europe, the Second World War. And in particular, from the Battle of the Bulge, which is probably one of the most well-known Second World War battles. It contains soil, which has blood from American soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge in an urn inside of this case that I mentioned. This was hand-carried to Truman by American and Belgian soldiers and presented to him in 1946. So prior to the Marshall Plan, but certainly an incredible example of gratitude from Europe. And you can see some of the town names on the coats of arms there, on the case that's inside. And then this is the black item on the left is the urn, and then the soil from the Battle of the Bulge is inside of that urn. These are some drawings, paintings done by German school children to thank Truman for the school feeding program. The statistics about the school feeding program are there. You can see them, how they started out feeding 240 children and to feeding 820,000 children, a 350 calorie meal, 5 days a week. And you see on this poster or drawing that Bavarian students entered a competition to design a poster to thank President Truman. And so in our collection, in our museum, we have the top 50 out of the, I think it was about 500,000 posters that were made by German children thanking Truman. You can see the ship there with the stars and stripes, and then the planes, and then the different architecture from the United States over to Europe. And I think I've got another example of those. There's another one. I can't read the German writing, I'm afraid, but you can see the skyscrapers on the left. And then in this case, it's sailboats. That's not really how they transported, of course, but student imagination. And you can see them loaded up with goods coming across the Atlantic and then them stepping foot in Europe when they come over to the right side. So Truman was really enamored by these posters, and we have them on display in our museum that we just recently renovated. So a wonderful artifact to show gratitude from, in this case, German children. And then on display, just to show you some examples of both gratitude and also the implementation. This is a photograph from the National Archives. This is in Yugoslavia as it was known then. This is Yugoslavs watching a boat coming from Greece, which was the boat's first stopping point. A flower that came in from Salonika, arrived in Salonika, Greece from Texas, and then part of that shipment then went on to to Greece. Yugoslavia was, the reason I use this one, Yugoslavia is actually technically not part of the Marshall Plan, but they actually received a separate $69 million aid program from the United States. And you can see the waiting faces as they're waiting for the first shipment to arrive of flour from Texas to Greece to Turkey. Excuse me, Yugoslavia, apologize. This is a kind of a symbolic photograph of this tank that comes in to France. And you can see why I'm showing you this. The caption on there is 1 millionth ton for France. Now, the issue here is that most of the aid was foodstuffs and things like that, but military equipment, industrial equipment was certainly part of this too. In fact, one of the reasons they got more and more European cooperation was this idea of mutual defense, which manifested itself in 1949, and an organization that's very much in the news today. In 1949, Truman helped form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And most historians agree that the forerunner of NATO was through the Marshall Plan, as they started to give military aid and military assurance, ultimately leading to the NATO treaties of 1949. So there's certainly a legacy there of the Marshall Plan in terms of the formation of NATO. And we see NATO at the forefront of the news today, particularly with the situation in Ukraine. And then in our museum and library collection, we have this incredible book. It doesn't look like it from the cover, so bear with me. But here we see this book called The Marshall Plan at the Mid-Mark. So I mentioned before, they had to go to Congress every year, or in the first case, 15 months, and then after that, every 12 months, to get additional appropriations. So they would come up with these reports that they would present to Congress showing the progress of the Marshall Plan. Here you see Paul Hoffman in the middle, who's the director of the plan, Dean Acheson on the left, and then George Marshall himself on the right. And they've got this book, but I'm very fortunate to have been able to scan some of the interior pages. And so you can see this is one of the interior pages. And some of these statistics are astonishing. So it's talking about halfway through the Marshall Plan, coal production has risen 17%, steel production 52%, electrical power, cement production, cotton yarn production, grain production, sugar, meat, milk, fats, oils. This is all in Europe. So they're not only providing aid and money and so forth, but they've also helped regain the agricultural and industrial strengths that Europe has during that time. We're going to get to the question about those refused the Marshall Plan at the end, if I may. I do see your question. Here kind of leads into this map. So thank you for that segue. These are the countries that received aid. Those are those shaded in gray, and you see the flags there. And those countries in white are those that did not. So let's maybe answer that question now. The aid was offered to the Soviet Union and to those Eastern Bloc countries. And in fact, some of those Eastern Bloc countries, like Czechoslovakia, as it was called then, now the Czech Republic today, were very willing and wanting to take the aid. But because of the control by Stalin of those Eastern European countries, Stalin refused that aid, would not let them take the money. And they set up their own economic aid package coming out of Moscow, which was a complete failure. So you can see those Eastern European countries. You'll see Spain too is left off this. And that's because the associations with Franco and the disputes over the Spanish Civil War had left tensions between the rest of Europe and Spain. And so money was not offered there. But you can see some of the defeated nations, Germany and Italy, for example, were both offered aid and received aid. Now, when I say Germany, it's the Western zones. Germany was divided into those 4 zones at the Potsdam Conference. So the Western zones, what became West Germany in 1949, received aid through the Marshall Plan, as did Italy. Here's some of the interior pages, and these are just showing some examples. So you can see on the left there, Manchester dock workers unloading a US ship. Flour from Higginsville, Missouri, just down the road from where I am in Independence. A flour going to Greece. A lady moving into a new house in Copenhagen, Denmark. and then weaving cotton in France, and then the architect there on the bottom right, I think that got cut off, but I believe that's in the Netherlands. And then here's one of my favorite photographs, and it kind of summarizes the Marshall Plan in one photograph. And this is a Missouri mule alongside a Greek mare, and they're plowing a field in Greece. So Missouri mules were sent from Missouri by President Truman through the Marshall Plan to help with agriculture. Truman used mules himself as a farmer, as a young man. And here you see the cooperation that I was talking about between Europe and United States. So let's just move on. Here you see a kind of before and after of a Belgian metalworks that's inside the book that I mentioned, kind of from its destruction on the left to its rehabilitation and back up into working order on the right. And then there was so much appreciation for the Marshall Plan, or as we call it, the Economic Recovery Program, that in Italy they held exhibits to promote it. And this is the exterior of the exhibit. You see the ERP there for an exhibit that was held in 1949. And then interior, you see these posters, food, coal, oil, cotton displays with the flour and the coal and the oil drums. So this is the interior, one of the slides of the interior of that exhibit. And then my conclusion, we have about, whoops, sorry about that. Pressed too many buttons at once. I want to make sure I have time for questions, but I do want to get to my conclusion too. And my mouse is, here we go. So as you can imagine, this was an incredibly bold program. Most expensive initiative ever attempted. As I mentioned, 16.5 billion in today's dollars. Changes with inflation every day, of course, but it's about $170 billion in today's money. Not only did it stop any kind of economic depression, which people were worried about, it also paves the way for political independence in those countries that were threatened by communism. And that was not unintended. They were very worried, particularly. There was elections in 1948 in Italy, where it looked like the communists were going to win. And there's a lot of speculation that the CIA helped that election go a different direction. So that's something you can look into. They were very worried about the spread of further communism from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. But it also, not only did it avert the threat of economic depression, it rebuilt industry, it rebuilt agriculture in Europe, across Europe, but it also paid for these kinds of cooperative efforts. So the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, North Atlantic Treaty Organization I mentioned, and ultimately the European Union. That started out more as kind of a cooperation of countries that produce steel and coal, and they kind of united around that. And then as they went into the 50s, they started what we call the common market. And then that developed in the 1970s and 80s more into how we see the European Union today. So certainly a legacy. And then the bullet points there on the right, the idea of America being isolated like they were prior to World War I, that idea is over. Europe is being assisted by America. America's got the foot in Europe, and people are critical of that. Others are supportive of that. It's a true example of the containment policy that Truman held as part of his foreign policy, part of the Truman Doctrine, containing communism, not letting it spread. The idea of rebuilding your enemy is fairly unique at that time. So, get your enemy, instead of reparations after World War I, here's the idea of rebuilding your enemy and bringing them back to an equal footing. It's been regarded as, a huge, great humanitarian effort. And you see that phrase used, Marshall Plan for Africa, Marshall Plan for AIDS, Marshall Plan for South America. The Marshall Plan is used as a bellwether, as an example of a successful policy. And US aid, foreign aid programs came out of that concept. On the flip side, the Soviets in particular, and some critics in the United States, accused the United States of engaging in economic imperialism. So influencing these countries to kind of come around to your way of thinking through economic aid. So this idea of imperialism through economics was a criticism that was made. So let me stop my screen sharing and get the chat back up. And you are welcome to start to write your questions on the chat while I take the questions that you have posed. And somebody asked about how much is that in today's dollars? So we got that one.
And Mark, just as a heads up, only you and I can see the comments and the questions.
Okay.
So just make sure to read them aloud
those
before you answer them.
Yeah, so James asked, how many years was the 30 billion spread? It was spread over 4 years. And then I think I answered, how much is that? It was 16 billion. And then it was not 13. And it was over 4 years. And that's about 168 to 170 million, depending on the inflation of the day and whether you compare that to the euro or something like that. 16 nations. Do you have a pencil? I can read through them real quick. I just happen to have a chart to my left, so I haven't memorized them. But the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, Greece, Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, West Germany. Hopefully you weren't counting. Yeah, Ireland did receive aid. It's kind of very similar to Yugoslavia. There were countries that received aid that were not necessarily part of the plan. Yeah, the aid to Asia was separate, but there was aid to Asia. There's also aid to South America through something called the 0.4 program. So there's different aid around the world. But the Marshall Plan specifically was for European countries. But there was aid to Japan, and there was aid to South America. And the South American aid comes under what we call the 0.4 program, which happens more in Truman's second term after the 48 election victory. What do the European countries need to do to receive the money? Well, they did have to kind of sign off. They had to kind of come together cooperatively. Those 16 nations came together to form the plan with Marshall of how the money was going to be implemented. And there were, I won't go through all the details, but there were some restrictions on how the money could be spent. They actually put in a proposal. Think of it like a grant proposal. You write a grant, you ask for the money, and then it comes back, and then they oversee that. However, it's important, they mostly were not grants. They were grants, not loans. So you didn't have to pay them back. I think my numbers might be a little off. 95 to 98% of the money was given and didn't have to be paid back. However, they did have to match dollar for dollar that money. So when they say you're a country and you got $1 million, you had to match that in your own country. And what the different countries did that in different ways. So the United Kingdom, where I'm from, has put the money to reduce the debt that they had in the United Kingdom government. Other countries put it into funds to spend on other projects, but they had to fund that out. Now in Austria and in Germany, some of that Marshall Plan money that they put in as matching funds still exists today. They're still spending that money, which is kind of remarkable. So it has a real legacy in terms of the infrastructure programs and things like that. I like the comment about the Belgian chocolate in the green box. Any other questions? And thank you for the kind comments there too.
Just so you don't have to read them out loud, Mark, I'll read the kind comments. Janice says, thanks for this great presentation. Steve says, fantastic lecture, very informative. Frank says, bravo, superb, concise, and historically relevant.
Absolutely relevant, for sure. Absolutely relevant. And we've had quite an amazing week, but yeah.
Joyce, I apologize, you might have already answered this. Joyce wanted to know, who were the countries who refused the Marshall Plan?
So mostly it was the Eastern European countries, and because of Stalin's influence.
Right.
So some of them actually wanted the money. In March of 1948, the Czech government was overthrown by the Soviets. So they were ready to accept the money, and then suddenly they were a puppet state of the Soviet Union. So those puppet states, as we call them, were not allowed, even if they wanted the money, they were not allowed to take it. And Stalin actually set up a separate economic aid plan in kind of retaliation, but it didn't really work in the same way.
Gotcha. Maddie says outstanding. Claudia says this was excellent. I don't see any additional questions. We're early, Mark, but that's okay with me. So folks, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mark for a wonderful presentation. Mark, I'll circle back to you in about 30 seconds. But folks, just a reminder for those watching live, you'll receive an email from me tomorrow with a feedback survey. Please take 30 seconds and fill that out. Also, there'll be a recording. There'll be information about some other U.S. presidential programs that might be of interest. And I'll also thank the partnering libraries in that email. Mark, do you have any last words before we wrap it up?
Just if any, and we had people from all over the country and Canada and everywhere else. If everyone's in the Kansas City area, I really encourage you to come to our brand new renovated museum. We just finished a $30 million renovation. You can see that Belgian urn. You can see those children's drawings of the aid packages, the gratitude paintings, amongst many other things to deal with Truman's life and presidency. So if you're in the Kansas City area, please come visit. Incidentally, that book, the Marshall Plan of the Mid-Mark, it's all been digitized and the whole thing is online on our website.
All right, good to know. All right, Mark, well, thank you all so much. Thank you all for watching. I hope everyone enjoys the 4th of July, and we'll see you soon. So thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.